Welcome everyone to the 1.5 degree C global teach-in. I'm Ed Mazria. I'm founder and CEO of Architecture 2030. Today we're going to set the new 1.5 degree C budget, targets, timeline, and the actions we, responsible for the built environment, must take right away. The sessions today will focus on planning, architecture, and construction, and the tools, policies, and strategies available that will effectively reduce emissions and keep planetary warming to 1.5 degrees C. So with that, let's begin the presentation. We, as you all know and can probably see and feel out there, are in a full-blown climate emergency. And timing is everything. The problem is, obviously, is that we keep burning fossil fuels in the built environment. And that's what we're here to discuss, and that's what we're here to get a handle on. You've all heard a lot of talk about carbon budgets, but very few people know what that means and what the timeline is to stay within those budgets. So the 1.5 degrees C carbon budget is 340 gigatons of CO2. That gives us a high probability to meet the 1.5 degrees C. So 340 gigatons is what we have left in our carbon budget in order to meet that target, the 1.5. So today, we are emitting roughly 40 gigatons of CO2 every year globally. It will probably be a little bit less this year, but it's expected to go right back up. We all hear quite a bit about the 2050 date, phasing out to 2050. So if we peak emissions today and we phase out carbon emissions by 2050, that's 600 gigatons. That's almost double our carbon budget today. That's because we've actually not reduced emissions since the Paris Agreement, which is when we established a 2050 date. So how do we meet the 340 gigatons? Well, we need a 65% reduction between now and 2030, and then we need to phase out all CO2 emissions by the year 2040. That gives us a high probability, or a 67% chance, of phasing out CO2 emissions. So how do we do that? That's what we're here to talk about during this day. First, a few statistics. By 2060, world urban population is expected to increase by about 2.75 billion people, which is equal to the entire population growth estimate. That's how much population we're expecting to grow, and in and around cities, we're going to be adding those people. So every week, to like put this in perspective, every week about 1.5 million people are being added in and around cities worldwide. So where is all that going to take place, and where's all the construction going to take place for all of that growth? Well, once we come out of the pandemic, we're expecting to see most of the construction take place in the global north, where we're seeing essentially where we have a lot of the wealth is right now, and those countries that can then begin start up their infrastructure with incentives and programs. So we expect to see North America, Europe, China begin constructing right away. Right after that, we're going to see construction begin to move into the global south. And we're going to begin to see an explosion in the global south about 10 years out. And then that explosion continues to where we see most of the construction then taking place in the global south. The global north obviously will be built out. Most of the population growth is in the global south. So it's critical that we get the construction right in the global north, so we set up the whole process for construction over the next 20, 30 years. What's the problem? What's the issue? Well, if we look at where all our forests are, especially our tropical forests, we can see they're all in the global south, right in the path of all the construction expected to take place in the near future. Most of the vertebrae in the world is located in that same area, in the global south. And deforestation is taking place essentially mostly in that area. These are the high-risk areas. And if we deforest, then we begin to lose more plant and animal species, and we keep emitting CO2. We're losing about 36 football fields worth of trees every minute due to deforestation. And that's responsible for an additional 8 to 10% of annual global CO2 emissions. So that has to stop. Let's look at this area in dark red, one of the high-risk areas. This was in 1984. I want you to kind of focus within that square. This is the Amazon, and the dark green is where we have most of the tree cover and the tropical forest. And I'm going to fast forward now to today, essentially today, 2016. And you can see a lot of that dark green is gone. That is deforestation in the Amazon. I'm going to focus on a small area, one of those light areas where we've lost trees, and see what does that look like. Well, this is what it looks like. You can see the dark green is the Amazon, and the light brown is where we've lost all of that forest. This little white dot there is Sinop. That's a small city in the middle of the Amazon. I'm going to go down now and focus in to see what all that light stuff is and what that town looks like. So this is what the town looks like from an aerial view. And you can see what all that light stuff is around. That's all farmland. So once the city begins to start and begins to grow, we then begin to create a whole bunch of agriculture, take down trees, and use it for crops and cattle and extractive industries. So that's how deforestation happens. This was signed up in 1973 when the first road was put in and a few little roads scratched out of the Amazon. This is what it looks like today, a sprawling, low-rise sprawling city. You can't even, there's no Amazon to be seen here. So how do we get to a carbon positive built environment? Well, it's a two-step process. Step one is planning, design, construction, and electrification. That's what we're responsible for. And step two are renewables. We can get 70 to 80% there by designing and constructing the built environment in the right way. This is what we call the no cost or low cost, or actually cost savings option. And that's everything from growth boundaries to compact cities, transportation, public transportation, urban farming, actually moving that farmland back into the city and growing our crops and vegetables right in the city. Designing our buildings right, using passive solar strategies, for example, and using the right materials, and actually then moving to carbon sequestering buildings and materials. That gets us 70 to 80% of the way there. That's all know-how. That's all knowledge-based. Step two is the other 20 to 30% is renewables. It's on-site renewables, it's solar, it's utility scale renewables, solar, wind, hydro. We have to scale that up, and I'll show you what that begins to look like in a minute. Now, all of the strategies, we put most of the strategies into what we call the 2030 palette. It's a design and planning platform. And we will be building out this platform. It goes everything from large-scale planning strategies to designing buildings and selecting materials. After the teaching, we'll have gained quite a bit of knowledge. We'll take all that and be adding to the palette, put it into the palette in the months to come. So we also know that density is kind of getting a bad name because of the pandemic. And we've seen a lot of articles about density being a risk, spreading the pandemic and becoming a risk factor. Let's put that to bed today. An analysis of 913 counties in the US indicates that density is not a COVID-19 infection risk factor. In fact, suburban and rural areas have a much higher death rate than urban cores because they have less access to healthcare and medical facilities. That was a study done in the US and published in the Journal of American Planning Association. If we look globally at the situation, and we look at density, this is just recent, as of September 6th, we look at density and cases and deaths. Let's take a look at just two cities, New York City and Seoul, about the same size, Seoul slightly bigger, an additional 1+ million people. Seoul is a denser city, and look at the deaths per million population. Totally different on an exponential scale. So density is not an indicator of cases or deaths. There are many, many other issues, and one that we can control somewhat is overcrowding, where we're putting so many people in a space. That begins to lead to higher transmission rates. So density by itself is not a problem. So how do we reset to meet the 1.5 degrees C carbon budget? Well, the built environment's emissions take place in three areas. One is new buildings, building operations. Two is existing buildings. The entire existing building stock is obviously operating and generating CO2 emissions. And the third is all this construction that's going to take place requires energy and emits carbon. We call that embodied carbon. So let's take a look at new buildings. What do we have to do very quickly for new building operations as we're designing buildings? We need to design them to zero carbon standards. They need to come in at zero carbon. If they don't, they're adding to the problem. How do we do that? Well, we put in place what's called a zero code. It's actually a zero carbon building code standard. This is not rocket science. It exists. We have local and international zero carbon standards. They've been developed. You can actually get them at zero-code.org. They're fairly simple. They're efficiency, so you design an efficient building, and then you electrify that building, make sure it's all electric, no on-site fossil fuels or gas, and then you use renewables to supply the electricity. That gets you to zero carbon. Why is that critical? Remember that map I showed you? Global North, Global South? This is where there are, you see in the Global South, there are either no codes or only codes for partial parts of the built environment, and no zero codes in this area. And in the Global North, to be honest, there are no zero codes. There are a few zero codes, but not much. They have to upgrade their codes to zero so that when we get to the Global South and it explodes, those codes are in place and are being used widespread. So this is the zero code. You design an efficient building. Any new code standard, ASHRAE 90.1, 2016, 2019, the IECC, Title 24 code standards in Europe, they will all get you a somewhat efficient and fairly efficient building. You take that code, you can upgrade it every 3 years to become more efficient, or every few years, and you then add on-site. And if you can't do it on-site, if you have a high-rise building, for example, you can't get it all on-site, then you import off-site, but you import renewable energy. So anything you import to the building must be new, renewable, non-CO2 emitting energy. That gets you to a zero carbon building. And that's how you put in place zero codes. The IECC just adopted the 2021 IECC, which will be out in the next month or so, just adopted the zero code as an appendix, so it can be used with any IECC building code. China developed a nearly zero energy plus on-site and off-site renewables standard. That needs to be adopted throughout China. It has been developed. And we know that by the end of the year, there's a directive that the European countries need to have in place a nearly zero energy building code that then uses on-site and off-site to get to zero carbon. And during the day, we'll hear about that, the European advancement in codes. Okay, that takes care of new buildings. We have to get a code standard in, and we have to design to a zero carbon code. What about existing buildings, existing building operations? Well, if we look at cities, any city, we see that there are buildings that are large emitters, and then lots of buildings that are small emitters. You can see the downtown area here of Seattle, huge buildings, and those emit quite a bit of energy. In fact, quite a bit of emissions, use a lot of energy. In fact, they are responsible for almost half of all Seattle's emissions, that small clump of buildings. You can see that same pattern throughout the entire United States. This is where all the really big buildings in New York City are, in downtown Manhattan, Midtown, and downtown Brooklyn. The rest are smaller scale buildings, miles and miles, a million small scale buildings, or millions. Those few buildings are responsible for about half of all emissions. You can see that in Pennsylvania. You see the same typology in Chicago, in Los Angeles, in Mexico City, large downtown, huge buildings, responsible for a lot of emissions, quite a portion of the emissions. Madrid, Spain. Again, you see that same typology all the way to Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. All these new buildings, huge buildings going up, are responsible for quite a bit of emissions. So given that, we can develop policies for existing buildings because the cities are essentially, in the built environment, essentially similar. The first thing we need to do is understand intervention points, and to understand that when a building is going to be upgraded or there's going to be a renovation, to actually upgrade it to a more efficient standard and get it to zero carbon costs 75% less, or could be zero if you're importing that energy, zero carbon energy. Then if you force somebody to do it and they're not going to build, for example, and you then have them do all this construction. So intervention points are really key. So policies for existing buildings. Let's look at the large building emitters. So if you look at a city, you find the large building emitters responsible for 30, 40, 50% of all emissions, and you require them to electrify and then use renewables for the electricity that they're going to use. You require that by 2030. You give them 10 years to do it. So if they hit a capital improvement cycle or they're going to renovate, then that's when they do it, because it's pretty inexpensive. And you provide incentives for buildings for building owners to go early. Give them fast track permitting or low interest loans or tax abatements or rebates. There are all sorts of strategies where you can incentivize people to renovate to zero carbon. So for large buildings, you want to make sure that you have a date certain, a 2030 date certain, that they all have to get to zero carbon. For all the other buildings, you require electrification plus renewables at those building intervention points when construction is going to take place. And that's if there's a zoning or use change, or if they're renovating, or if they're replacing equipment, or if they sell a building. Usually the new owner is going to come in and renovate. You require electrification plus on-site and off-site renewables at that point. And you also provide incentives for these small buildings to go first. Give them the same incentives that you would for the large buildings to get the zero carbon. So that's how you develop policies. So let's look at something that's happened in the US. Our building codes, we keep upgrading our building codes every year. And in 2005, we learned about this issue and had a call to the entire building sector and the architecture and planning community to really change the way they practice. So this is GDP. This is gross domestic product. This is economic activity in the US. You could see there was a lull. We had a great recession in 2008, 2009, and we came out of it in 2010, and then GDP growth went up. Well, as we have a lot of economic activity, you would expect that floor area would go up also. We have a lot of construction. And during that period between 2005 and 2019, we constructed 47 billion square feet, or 4.37 billion square meters. So we did quite a bit of construction during that period. But look at what's happened to energy consumption in the entire building sector. It didn't go up with all that construction. In fact, it went down slightly, 1.7%, and emissions actually went down to 21% in the building sector. So in the US, our entire building sector is down 21%. Now, that's great news, but it's also somewhat problematic because essentially this is what we've done. This is electricity consumption in the US. You can see from 2005 out to today, it's actually quite flat. But look what's happened. We've reduced the amount of coal generation in the US, but we've increased natural gas. We've increased our renewables also, which is the good news. However, 63% of our grid is still fossil fuel based. And as we build new natural gas plants, we're locking in those fossil fuels. So we need a moratorium on any new emissions from plants, electric plants. Now, let's look at Central and South America. This is actually fascinating. While electricity consumption increased, it's kind of flattened out the last few years, and fossil fuels increased in terms of electricity generation. It's still a very small portion of electricity generation in Central and South America. 65% of all the electricity generated in that region is renewables. So, as we implement a zero code and then begin to renovate, what we need to do then is increase the amount of renewables in that area, and then we can reduce the amount of fossil fuels and get to zero carbon. So the third element, the last element, is materials and construction. There are literally millions of materials we can choose from. This is the way the pie is shaped. Building operations 28%, and then the core and shell is 11%, and then the rest of industry is 30%. So building construction, but there's still literally thousands of materials we can choose from. So how do we get a handle on all that? It's huge, the number of materials we get to choose from. So we reshape the pie, and we see that in the entire industrial sector, three materials, really two materials, concrete and steel, are responsible for half of all the industrial sector's emissions, and most of the concrete and steel goes to buildings and infrastructure. So if we get a handle on those two, just those two materials, we actually can make huge strides in getting industrial emissions down. So now what? So the first thing we need to do is change the conversation. And that conversation is changing. And you can see in mainstream media, concrete, the most destructive material on earth, steel makers, there's now pressure on the steel makers to get to zero carbon. And architects are now beginning to use mass timber, glue laminated construction instead of steel, for example, and concrete, and putting pressure on steel and concrete to change so that they can keep market share. And that's actually happening. So what do? We have to reuse, reduce, and sequester. Those are the three items. And reuse is a planning, design, and specifications and policy strategy and issue. That's everything from repurposing urban areas rather than ripping them down and having to pour all that concrete and steel and everything, is redesign them, repurpose them. Adaptive reuse. We're going to see quite a bit of that after the pandemic as we begin to renovate buildings for slightly different uses. And we can design to deconstruct that materials and then reuse them later on, so we're not just throwing them in a waste pile and creating more CO2 emissions. So how do we reduce? Same issue, planning, design, specifications, and policy. It's everything from land use, growth boundaries, densification, infill, optimizing structures, specifying low carbon or carbon positive materials, and policy. And we'll be talking about that throughout the day. The third item is sequestering materials, and that's actually buildings that suck carbon out of the atmosphere. Buildings and materials, everything from wood and bamboo to carbon positive materials to injecting CO2 in concrete to biomaterials, and landscapes and urban agriculture is also going to be key, and we'll hear a lot more about that today. So can we meet the 1.5 degrees C carbon budget? This was Toronto in 1891. I'm going to fast forward to 2010. This is what it looks like today. How did that transition happen? We can see the same transition happening in Santiago, Chile, for example, and all the way to Ethiopia, all over the world. This transition to kind of modernism has taken place. Well, it took place in actually a very short period of time. In 1925, we had the first modern building. It was the Bauhaus building. Structure moved inside. We no longer had bearing walls, and we actually hung the exterior wall off the structure. That was in 1925. So what was going on in 1925? Well, in 1925, we had the first Model T truck. We didn't even have television then. We had radio vision. We made the first transatlantic call in 1927. So fairly, we might say from today's standards, fairly primitive. In 1928, conditions were so bad that the international architecture and planning community got together and decided to lay out an agenda and rules for designing and planning. Conditions were really pretty bad. And so they called for getting the housing out of the agricultural areas and had a whole series of planning recommendations. Le Corbusier came out with his building recommendations. The Villa Savoy, you can see structure moved inside. You can have large horizontal windows and glass and bring a lot of light and air into buildings. So that was 1928. In 32, it was called the International Style, Modernism. It made its way all around the world. We had the first exhibit. What was going on in the 30s was the first commercial airport, and then you had the Johnson Wax building in 1939. By 1949, you had an all-glass building. Philip Johnson developed this little glass building in a very, very cold climate. We could overcome any climate with fossil fuels. By 52, we had the Lever House, and the world had changed. And then we had the first city actually built on modern principles. So all that took place. In 27 years, we transformed the entire world in 27 years, and we did it with T-squares and triangles and slide rules. And we didn't even have an ink pen then. Ink pen, we didn't get an ink pen until 1960. It took years to develop a set of working drawings. And we didn't get the first laptop until 1991. So the tools we have available today, it's like years ahead of where we were, light years ahead. We can actually look at a building, look at the daylighting of a building, look at the heating and cooling of a building. We can structure anything now, and we can build up entire cities and look at the solar potential of every single building and every single side of a building. We will demonstrate, there'll be demonstrations all throughout the day, and make sure you attend some of them. These are some of the latest tools that we think are really groundbreaking tools that we'll introduce you to over the day. So how do we get to the 340 gigatons? It's not rocket science. We need a moratorium on new coal and gas plants, no hookups, no gas hookups, and we need to get the zero carbon building code in place, a zero zero code, a zero carbon building code in place as soon as possible. That will peak us in terms of emissions in the built environment. Then we have to phase out all coal plants by 2030, electrify 50% of our building floor area, and then get concrete and steel, get emissions down about 50%, all doable. If we do just that, that doesn't include transportation or all sorts of other things, we get down 54.3%, we get into the sweet spot. So can we meet the 1.5 degrees C budget? Of course we can. There is a commitment to meet the 1.5. It is on the CarbonPositive website. The actions are getting new buildings to zero, electrifying existing buildings, adopting zero codes, and getting a 40% reduction as soon as possible in embodied carbon, getting to zero embodied carbon steel and concrete by 2030, and then all other materials by 2040. Go on carbonpositive.org. We're asking firms and organizations and companies to sign, states to sign on to the commitment. We'll then take all that to Glasgow, and we'll hold a summit in October before the November Glasgow meeting. A week before, we'll hold a summit and present the commitment and put pressure on the cities and states and countries, especially the countries, to get the carbon positive as soon as possible. So it's up to us. So now I would like to turn this over to Farhana Yamin, a colleague of mine. I'd like to introduce Farhana. Farhana is an environmental lawyer. She was lead author of 3 assessment reports for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. She was key in getting the countries at COP21 in Paris in 2015 to agree to limit planetary warming to 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial levels. She will talk to us now about that, about the importance of that agreement in 2015 and the upcoming COP26 upgrade to that agreement coming up next year. So I will turn this over to Farhana.
Thank you, Ed. Brilliant. Well, good morning to all of those. I think there's 1,600 people listed on the participants. So a very warm welcome from me in London. I'm absolutely delighted to join this particular teach-in. And I'll speak, I think, for about 10 minutes, and hopefully we'll have some questions and answers. I see lots of them coming in, mainly to do with Ed's presentation. But also, I think that we'll have a chance to answer some of those from anything that I say, either during the question and answers phase or later in writing when things are put up on the various websites and so forth. So I want to really thank Ed and his amazing team, and for all of you joining to understand why we need to get to 1.5 and how we can do it. I'm going to say a few remarks. I've put up this one slide only for you to reflect a little bit. My first bucket of comments are really about where did 1.5 in Paris come from? How did it get in there? Who was pushing for this? When? And what now needs to be done in order to make good the promise that Paris had for its inclusion. So this is a little bit of a personal story. As Ed said, I'm one of the lawyers who's worked in the climate change negotiations since 1991. I started my life as a young lawyer with a full head of very jet black hair, actually, and it's now turned grey. The first COP, the Conference of the Parties, which took place in 1995, was shortly just after my daughter, who's now 25, was born. So this journey of mine is very personal, and every passing year, you know, as Alia, our daughter, gets older, I reflect more and more on the significance and the importance and why we have these international agreements. Since that first COP in 1995, we're going to have the 26th COP in Glasgow, which will be in November now of next year. It was postponed from this November due to COVID. These 26 COPs represent the international community's response to the issue of climate change. When I started off as a young lawyer fighting legally with the small island states, providing them with free legal advice and assistance in the UN negotiations, we were very much in a precautionary mode. We had the precautionary principles. The scientists had said, you've got this massive problem coming up, but you know, let's do win-win solutions, and there's plenty of time. Climate change wasn't even a reality at that point in the early 1990s. And as the subsequent IPCC reports started to come out, the science became firmer. And actually the tactics then of the business as usual, primarily the fossil fuel industry, but a lot of other inertia as well from many sectors, prevented essentially politicians and the public and professionals like you from acting quickly to take up those win-win, no-lose, no-regret opportunities. We had enormous resistance from the coal and gas and oil industry in particular, every week, every minute, every day, every year, and certainly now the last 2 decades of delay have been a very deliberate strategy by them to maintain their vast hold on the global economy and to try and kind of push forward the date by which we have to phase out all greenhouse gas emissions, which is included in the legal framework of the climate change treaties. There's been 3 of those treaties negotiated in those last 25 years. The 92 Convention, the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, and then the Paris Agreement in 2015, which itself was delayed from a failed summit in 2009 called the Copenhagen Summit, COP15. So I'm emphasizing this very long history because around 2007, when the IPCC third assessment report came out, a lot of the scientific advisors who worked with the vulnerable countries that I advise, very small atoll nations, the Maldives, Vanuatu, Kiribati, Samoa, the small island states, as well as larger countries like Costa Rica, many of Chile with its vast long coastline, very vulnerable to sea level rise changes, El Nino. All of these countries and their legal, scientific, economic advisors were very clear that the working goal of the climate treaty, this 2-degree target, which was not yet enshrined in law, was way too lax. And it wasn't in accordance with the emerging science. And they started to push for a recognition that this 2-degree target, which, as I said, wasn't enshrined in law at this time in any country, was not sufficient to save the world's most vulnerable ecosystems and would jeopardize thousands of communities, ecosystems, species, and countries. So from 2007 to 2009, the failed summit, these countries put forward the idea that we should limit temperature to 1.5 to safeguard their own obvious interests, but also to safeguard the world's vulnerable systems. So for me, the 1.5 goals inclusion in the Paris Agreement has taken literally 13 years. And during those 13 years, the fossil fuel industry in the main, but many others have been saying it's too late, it's too costly, we can't do it, we don't know how to do it, let's just stick to 2 degrees. And by the way, let's give ourselves a bit more time because we can always adapt our way out of this. So as you can imagine, this has been infuriating to the vulnerable countries. Now, the science of climate change in the IPCC's 5th assessment report and in the IPCC's 1.5 degree report, which came out in 2018, 3 years after Paris, has made very, very clear that huge numbers of people will be adversely impacted by 1.5. So what are we going to do about it, and what does Paris say? It says to strive to this lower threshold and to try and make sure also to deal with any loss and damage and adaptation needs that are now arising. Climate change is well and truly here with us as we speak already. I think what the significance of COP26, which is the big UN summit coming up, is that we have to revise the 5-year national targets that countries put forward in Paris. So they came to Paris 5 years ago with national targets that, if you aggregated all of the reductions that they were due to deliver, those targets added up to actually nearer 3 degrees, around 2.7 degrees than even 2, and they were way off track from the 1.5 that countries had committed themselves to. So even in Paris, we knew that we were off track, and we had to make good that mitigation gap. And thanks to people like Ed Mazria and many other foresighted leaders, they accepted, the diplomats and the advisors accepted that we should have, and the technical means for changing the trajectory of global emissions and bringing about positive benefits could be done. So COP26 is the global summit that is meant to present the revised, ambition-raising next set of commitments for all countries under the Paris Agreement. I don't need to tell most of you who are in the US that sadly the US will be leaving the Paris Agreement on the 4th of November. That will happen because, in fact, even if there is a change in administration, your administration won't change until January, and any it's quite an easy process to come back in for the US. But at the moment, the forces trying to stop and delay that ratcheting up of ambition, of trying to weaken the global rules that we've put in place that guarantee some kind of climate justice for the poorest communities, for the poorest countries who've done very little to contribute. That summit in Glasgow is the last chance for us to make sure that we phase out emissions in accordance with science. Ed's very helpfully always pointed out that we need now to phase emissions well before 2050. The 2050 date was the date that we had roughly given by the scientists back in 2015. It doesn't take into account the fairness issues, and it doesn't take into account the delay issues. So put bluntly, richer countries and countries that have historically emitted more and that have done less of their share under the existing pledges should do more, and they should phase out nearer 2040. And in order to do that, we have to treat this decade, the decade starting now, 2020 to 2030, as the decade that we phase out and commit to all greenhouse gas emissions, even if they may take slightly longer. So in passing, I feel that I can't emphasize enough the need for your profession of designers, planners, builders, the construction industry, to create a sense that we can change the facts on the ground. As a lawyer, we always say, possession is 9/10 of the law. And I think in terms of transformation, people don't have the imagination to see that we can really do this. And that's why your contribution is so important in showing that actually, not only can we do 1.5 to achieve carbon emissions, but that change that's needed will result in cleaner cities, cleaner air. It will result in less congestion. It will result in regenerating our high streets. It will result in local jobs that are good for people. It will result in resilient communities that can come together and see the spaces around them in a very new way. So I want to end just with the last minute or so. You can see a picture of where my personal efforts in the last year and a bit have taken me. It's very much on that. How do we change the facts on the ground? How do we repurpose, reuse, and retool our imaginations to use our existing spaces, high streets, shops, shopping centers that need to be changed and used in a very different way for a less consumption extractive, nature depleting way. And I've converted, along with many other local community groups, a cafe actually, that had been shut down on our main high street for over a year. It's called Think and Do, in the teal colours there. And recently we've taken over a much larger building, and you can see the car park of that building is empty, and it's just being converted now to a huge outdoor space with benches and stalls where people in a COVID-friendly and COVID-safe way will be able to get together in groups under 30, which is the current regulation now, and start to reimagine how their urban environment will look like. And I feel from those kinds of experiments will grow the imagination that will feed the energy and the talent and the technical expertise that you are bringing to the equation, and to really get us to a track to 1.5 and to make the climate summit in Glasgow a success. So I look forward to seeing some of you at the summit in person, I hope in October. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you. This is Ed. Thank you, Farhana, so much. That concludes the session. We don't have time to answer the questions, although we will answer them and post them online on our CarbonPositive website. So we'll try to get to all of those in a bit after the teaching.